Hello everybody, welcome to Channel 9 Live and welcome back for another edition of the Windows Community Stand-Up. Happy that you are joining us from wherever you are, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening. For the next 3 hours we're going to be talking about Windows, just kidding. We'll handle however long we'll go to talk about some great new news coming out of the Windows Dev platform. Really excited to be joined by a couple colleagues today. Kevin Gallo, who's the director of the Windows Dev platform, as well as Andrew Whitechapel, who's here to share some news for us today. So Kevin, I think you have some announcements you want to share right off the bat for us.
Yep. So first of all, I want to announce that we have a Windows Developer Day that's coming in March 7th. It'll be a live broadcast of a bunch of features coming in the next version of Windows. So we'll go in depth about a lot of the top level ones and talk about what they mean, what we've delivered, why they're exciting for developers to take advantage of them. Today, we want to kind of give you a little sneak peek into a few of them that we've been asked for. Several developers have asked for us to add a few capabilities. The three we'll cover today are multi-instance support, being able to run an application with multiple instances, console applications coming for a universal Windows platform, and then one that's kind of by not every developer, but several developers asked us to give them broader file system access. There's some of the constraints in UWP that have been just a little too hard for certain types of applications, and we'll cover that as well.
That sounds awesome. So the Windows Developer Days, we've done those a couple times. Gives us great insight into more of the depth of the next release of Windows and things like that. So you mentioned that one's coming. I think the date on that is March 7th, right?
Yep, March 7th.
All right, so be sure to set your calendar reminders for March 7th and tune in for another exciting virtual conference of a lot of different depth that we'll be able to join into. But today, let's talk about those three things that you were mentioning. And I think we've got a computer set up, so we'll be able to, I'm assuming we're going to actually see some things. None of this is vaporware.
Nope.
We're going to actually, all right, this is awesome.
A lot of it's already available in the insider builds, so developers can take a look at it.
All right, that's great. So let's dig right in. And so Andrew, I think these are some of your areas that you're responsible for.
Yes, that's right.
And maybe we should talk about console apps first. I know that that's something that's real interesting to developers. And as I think about console apps and how me as a user use them and developers and how productive they are for the developer workflow and everything like that, one of the promises of the UWP platform is writing code that runs on any device. When we think about console apps, like, how does that work for devices like HoloLens and things like that?
Well, so the idea behind console app support in the universal platform is to provide some level of parity with what you could do with Win32. So it's really addressing the audience of developers who like to build command line tools, sort of headless tools that use the console for input and output. And they're used to doing it in older technologies, but up until now they haven't been able to do it in UWP. So right now we've restricted it to desktop and IoT, mainly because desktop and IoT both actually have consoles. So to your question, HoloLens doesn't have a console, so we can't use console apps on HoloLens. That's not to say that we couldn't add that later, because all of the core infrastructure to support console apps is already, it's in the core platform. So it is actually available to all devices. It's just a question of whether that device has a console or not.
It's more of a shell model.
Yeah, I was going to say,
the shell doesn't really have a console model, especially in mixed reality, or even on Xbox. And so if we add that feature into the shell, then it'll be something that we would then support.
It's another great example of kind of the layered system that UWP has. Is right. Mm-hmm. There is a core, and we build capabilities on anything that writes to the core will be able to run on these devices. But we also built in unique capabilities that are device appropriate and scenario appropriate and things like that. Right. So it's really great for developers to tailor experiences where they need to and have common experiences where it makes sense.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah,
great. Right. So let's. Looks like you have a demo queued up for us. Let's take a look at what some of those new capabilities are.
Well, I don't really have a demo. What I have is because all of the support for console is in the plumbing in the app model. So what I've got, though, I'm going to just go ahead and do a file new because we have some templates. Let me go over to C++. So I've got a couple of console templates: C++ CX and C++ WinRT. So I'll just create one of those. And the templates are on Visual Studio Marketplace right now. We've only got C++ right now for console. We'll be adding the others later, and at some point they'll either be folded into the Windows Template Studio or into Visual Studio directly. But this is it. This is what you get. So really, there's nothing much in here. You can see I've got main. In fact, let me just run this while I'm talking about it. I'll go ahead and build that. you can see all I've got, I'm using standard old style APIs. I'm using wprintf, and I'm using getchar and putchar and so on. And I'm just printing out a string, and then I'm walking through my command line arguments. I'm saying, well, for each one, just print it out.
So, well, it may not be a big thing. That is a UWP app having a main in it.
Yeah, that's right.
So we have standard main using standard C++ syntax, no little hats. Very, very simple to go build this type of application and reuse a lot of the other code that people have for consoles, as it's just a very, very standard desktop style console
that's
app.
right. And it's not obvious from this, because you look at this and you think, oh, well, that's main. It's got a few lines of input and output in there. There's nothing special about that. But the point is, this is a UWP app. So this gets packaged up in an AppX. You can put it in the store. Users can download it from the store and install it, and you get all the normal benefits of UWP apps. But it has a main, as you say.
Awesome.
And so a developer who's coming from a traditional environment where they're used to coding directly to main, they can just cut and paste their code and stick it straight in here. I mean, to validate this, we actually did cut and paste code from a number of just random apps, Findstra and NetHack and Pacman and various other things, just to see, well, what do we need to change? In a few cases, we had to add some APIs to the WAC approved list, but really that was it. We didn't change any code. It was really all in the project settings that we had to change, and those project settings tie up to what we've done in the infrastructure. So from an app developer's perspective, they could take, by and large, they could take their old Win32 console app and just port it directly to a UWP and get all the benefits of UWP now.
Awesome, that's great. So when I think of console apps too, as a user and as a developer in my workflow, I usually have a console, and I usually type just ping or whatever the app is, right? So I have this command that I just run. Is that did my world change in any different now that I have a UWP console app? Now, do I have to use my mouse to launch my console app? This is what I'm asking.
So you get the benefits of both worlds. So you can launch it from a command prompt, PowerShell prompt or a command window or Windows R or whatever. Because let me just show you the manifest. There's a couple of things that are interesting in the manifest. I have to open this as text because there's no visual designer support for this. So let me just point out a couple of things here. First of all, a couple of namespace declarations we have to put in here, because this is where the additional attributes are defined, and it's these two attributes. So right now, as I said, it's only desktop and IoT, so we've got those two namespaces. And we have to add subsystem console and supports multiple instances. So that's added to the application node, and it's also added to the app execution alias. Now, app execution alias was something we introduced a couple of releases back for desktop bridge apps, and then we extended them to normal windowed UWP apps in the last release. And in this release, we're using the same mechanism for console apps. So if I open a console one, you can see my alias app is just the name of the app in this case. Obviously, you could change that to whatever you want.
So that could be foo.
That could be foo, yeah. Okay. It's whatever shortcut you choose for your app. And typically your app wouldn't be called app 1, it would be called something longer, so your shortcut would be shorter, so it would make more sense. But so I've built and deployed this app, so I can now go to a command console, and I can say app 1, and I can say some arguments, whatever, and it's just walking through. You can see how that ties up to the code in the template. It's just walking through, printing each one out. But the point is, I can execute it from the command line. I can provide whatever command line arguments my app chooses to recognize with options and switches and whatever else I want to provide. And it's app defined. But I'll just get all of those arguments coming in, and I can do what I like with them.
And so that execution alias you had that you mentioned was actually part of a previous update. I think it was probably in the fall creators update. The deployment model of UWP takes care of registering that alias, right? So I don't have to, now that I have the console app installed, in order to get that app 1 shortcut, I don't have to go in my environment variables, add to my path, and do something unnatural, right? It's just the deployment model has seen that execution alias and does whatever that work is needed behind the scenes. That's great. That's great.
Yes, it registers that alias. So you'd pick an alias that's meaningful to you. I mean, the template just spits out whatever the name of the app is, but you would pick some meaningful alias. And then when the app is installed, that alias gets registered. So it's basically, you can think of it as being appended to the end of the path in your environment. So it's always available regardless of where you execute it from.
That's awesome. How many times did you not know where it was? You had to find the path, or search back, tab it, and find the path for it. Now it's automatic.
Yep.
So one of the beauties of UWP having a known identity is a system can just handle all of that for you, but with the simplicity of using the command line.
Yep.
So I also noticed in the manifest you mentioned another thing that we actually wanted to talk about was in the manifest entry you said we got to add the support multi-instances equals true here.
Right.
So let's talk about the new multi-instance feature. Now as a UWP developer, when I think multi-instance, I think of what we had in the initial release of the UWP platform where I can do multiple views. Mm-hmm. How is this different?
So I think first of all we should explain a little bit what multi-instance, multi-view is.
Yeah.
Typically for a Win32 developer, and even for just a desktop when you have multiple windows and you launch say Calculator, every time you launch it you want a new window and you want them to be completely independent. I can do one calculation in one, another calculation in another. And then sometimes you have applications like Word, where most of the time when I launch a new instance, I get a new document. But if I happen to launch the same one, I want to reuse it so I don't open the same file twice. Both of those are really multi-instance models. Multi-view, you tend to say if I wanted two views on the same data and share the state, which is much more rare. Except on, say, mobile devices like a phone, where UWP also wanted to go work, or even HoloLens, when I launch it, I don't want a whole new app launched. I tend to want to go back to the previous app. So we want to make sure we can address each of these in the right way. So when you're on a phone or a single instance, when I want to go back to the app, I want that one rehydrated, versus where I have a multiple window model, and I want to launch new instances of those windows. So in desktop, you can get a multi-instance model, yet on these other devices, even in Xbox, you're really only running one app at a time.
Right.
You're never really running it. So if you go back, you really go back to that same instance. Where on the desktop, you hit on the taskbar if you want to go back to the same window. And so it's a much more natural to the user model for a desktop application.
And so what we've done in this upcoming release for the multi-instance, is it as simple as me just entering that flag, or do I have to do more work as a developer that's different?
It depends what you want to do. So again, as part of validating this feature, as we were building it, we ran through a number of store apps, and so it's an opt-in model, but we opted in, we sort of artificially opted in a number of store apps to be multi-instance. And that meant that obviously we didn't change any code at all because we couldn't, because these were store apps, so we were just getting them from the store. But we said, well, for these, we picked, there was a range of different apps, of different types of apps that do different types of things and different levels of complexity, so that we got reasonable breadth coverage to be confident that what we were doing was going to be okay. And we found that there were really three categories of apps. There were apps which tend to be the really simple apps where multi-instancing is probably not appropriate for them. They have no reason to be multi-instance. They're so simple, they don't do very much. There's no requirement for them to be multi-instanced. So fine, if we force them to be multi-instance, they still work because they don't care either way. It doesn't make any difference to them. So there's that category of stuff that will work, but they may or may not actually want it. Then there was a category of apps that did want multi-instancing. We had requests from app developers, both internal and external, saying, well, actually, we want multi-instancing. And we tried their apps. And some apps, they want multi-instancing, and they can take advantage of being multi-instancing. There's a good reason for it. Like in some cases, the app is just too complex to do multi-view. It's just too difficult to keep the things synchronized. So they wanted multi-instance instead, which is a much easier mechanism. And again, there was just a category of apps that just worked. We'd set the flag, say you're multi-instance, we'd ran them, we did multiple test passes, and they just worked. And then there was a category of apps which tended to be the more complex apps who wanted multi-instance, but when we forced them to be multi-instance, they would fail. And that's because those apps would need to do extra work. To your question, they'd need to do extra work. And the common thread in all of those was that they were doing something where they've always been safe to assume single instancing, because that's been the model up until now. So they've got some resource like a cache or a database or something where they're assuming exclusive access. And so they're not synchronizing the reads and writes, they're not protecting it in any way, there's no locks. And so so the first instance is fine, but as soon as the second instance comes up, and you start getting clashes of the reads and writes. And because they're not expecting it, that's when they fail. So there is a class of apps that will need to do work if they want to take advantage of this. And at the other end of the scale, there's some that don't need to do anything.
And so maybe you can show us a little bit of what some of
Yes.
those scenarios might look like in the dev experience.
Yes. Well, let me show you. So again, we've got some templates. We've got C++ templates. I'm going to go to the C# templates. If I can find my C# templates.
And are these templates also marketplace deployed right now?
Yes, these are in the VS Marketplace right now. So there's two different templates. One is kind of the simple one and the more complicated one. So let's look at the simple one first. I'll create one of these. It's going to generate code that's almost identical to the blank C# UWP application. And the only thing that's different, when it eventually creates it, the only thing that's different is in the manifest. So let me show you that first. All this code in the app class is exactly the same as what you would have in the blank template. So if I look at the manifest, again, I've got these two namespace declarations, desktop and IoT, because again, it's only supported right now on desktop and IoT. And I've got the supports multiple instances. So it's just the same as console. Console supports multiple instances, and it also had subsystem console. But if you just want a regular windowed UWP app, but you want it to be multi-instanced, then all you need as an absolute minimum is just that declaration. Say the application supports multiple instances. Let me run this.
So it's actually very similar to Win32. When you used to create your window class, you used to say to your window class, do you want to be multi-instance or single instance?
Right.
And so this is, in essence, a very similar way of doing that, except in a manifest.
It's more of a declarative model, putting the capabilities up front.
Rather than putting in the code, which was hard to, it's a different model.
Right.
Yeah, and this kind of maps, as I say, to the first category or even the second category of apps that we looked at, where the app may not actually need to do anything else apart from just set this flag in the manifest and it would just work. And as I say, we found a number of apps that basically that's what we did, and they just worked. So we obviously didn't change any code, the thing just worked. So here's the app running, and because I've now deployed it, I can go to the start menu, and this is app 2, right? So there's another instance of app 2 running. I can do this as often as I like. We don't impose any kind of artificial limits. You can run as many as you want. So I've now got 4 instances running of this app.
And these are separate processes. This isn't a trickery behind the scenes of just masking over the multiple views. It's actual different process.
No smoke and mirrors here. If I go to Task Manager, you can see I've got this is app 2 that I'm running. I've got 4 instances of app 2 with different process IDs. So these are separate processes.
So when we think about the developer model of UWP, one of the questions that came in, which is an interesting one as well, in a multi-instance app, when your code is calling some of the application data, some of the .current APIs, right, in the app model, is it going to that specific instance view of that, or is it kind of global? So when you think about like application data .current.
Right. Well, so there are some things that will be global because things like application data, for example, are package specific. So even though I've got 4 instances of the app running, they're all in the same package because it's one app package deployed. So anything that's package specific is going to be global to all 4 of these. So this is like the second category of apps where they're going to need to do a little work. If you're reading and writing to your local storage or to your settings, for example, you need to be careful if you've got multiple instances because again you'll have this read-write clash happening if you've got 2 instances writing at the same time. And there are standard mitigations that the app would impose, like it would either partition the data and use, if you're writing value sets or property name value pairs, you would have different name value pairs on a per instance basis, maybe, or you can identify each instance with some tag that you define and write the data based on that, or you would synchronize based on a named mutex, for example, to do locking.
So what are some, I know Kevin, you kind of set us up of the differences of like the multi-view and the complexity of some of these. What are some of the differences of why should I think about multi-view versus multi-instance? And if you had to pick some of the highlights of what are the pros and cons of each, what would they be?
I think you'd find that most apps want multi-instance. They're really about, hey, if the user wants to launch multiple versions, they want to be able to do multiple things, like Calculator. Ones where may not, like say a messaging app. You really only want to log in once. You want to have a shared instance. And yes, each conversation, take Skype for example, it really is going to be a one instance with one login, and then it wants the same instance, but it may pop up a different window for each conversation. But you don't really want two Skype apps running at the same time trying to get access to the resources. And then if you say, click a deep link, you don't want to figure out which one to go to. So that state where you have a single state, single log-on connection, and then really you're viewing multiple conversations. Or something. That's a canonical example. A file editor, on the other hand, like you could Notepad, it opens up a different instance every time, and that's good. I don't really need to share. If one crashes, as an example, if somehow I used all the memory or the app crashes, I don't want all my instances to crash. So as a developer, you get a little resiliency that if one crashes, all of them don't crash.
Oh, that's a good point. So even though they are the same application package, because they are isolated processes, they're isolated in protection of reliability, I guess.
Reliability.
Is a good term.
Yeah, you don't want.
If one of my instances crashes, it's not going to bring down the other one
Exactly.
for whatever maybe developer error code that I had.
Right.
Some crazy divide by zero that brings it down, or something like that. Okay,
Yep.
that's good. And so, is it fair to say that if I want to maintain state across kind of the views or the windows that my user wants to see, that multi-view is probably the better approach there? If I want to do some kind of data binding or share data across those different windows, is that like a decision factor that you would think about?
You have to. I think you really want to have. If you really want multi-view, it's really have many window management. Even Visual Studio has many windows being run to access different data, and they're complex apps to write, and usually they're larger applications. And if that's what you want to go do, that's what you go do. Otherwise, I would ultimately say multi-instance is a better model, especially as we start talking about our tab shell, where you have things in multiple places. Having one window and you recycle it tends not to be what most users want. They want multiple windows and then pivot between the two.
Yeah, and it's kind of a continuum as well, because there'll be some apps where multi-view may be more appropriate and some apps where multi-instance is more appropriate. And in the middle, there's apps where you could go either way, because maybe you need shared state and that kind of lends itself to the multi-view model more. But maybe you only need a little shared state, and most of what you do is partitioned, and so that lends itself more to the multi-instance model. So it kind of depends. At some point, there's an inflection where the app developer looks at what the functional requirements they need and how much work they're going to have to do, and somewhere along that continuum, they'll pick one or the other.
So I'm sensing a thread that I feel maybe some of our viewers will have here. Is we talked about console apps, we talk about multi-instance now, like. These feel like a little bit more privileges. And I think, and we actually had a question come through when we were talking about the console apps, is in a console app, do I now suddenly have more access to Win32 APIs? Do I have better file system access than I've had before?
Well, so yes and no. So you have more access to Win32 APIs only because we added more Win32 APIs to the web.
And this was what you previously mentioned. Yeah. So we have at Microsoft, we have a syndrome where we use acronyms a lot, right? And you mentioned in some of the testing with customer code, we had to add more APIs to what we call the WAC, right? This is the kind of the compliance approved list of APIs that are safe, for lack of a better term, that we want to call.
Yeah. I would say they're durable, public APIs that we maintain app compat with, and are not private. And having a well-defined set of APIs is a great thing,
right? Because
then we tell developers can trust it. Versus if they call something private, they found a way to call it, we change internals and we don't app compat against those. So I always feel like it's not that something like, oh, why are you filtering that? Well, no, this is our promise. Like, these are the APIs and we maintain compat, we test them. And for anything going into our store, we actually validate they're calling those APIs. Right. Not as a bad thing, but as a good thing, because otherwise we may actually break those applications not knowing what private APIs. So it's kind of a positive thing. And the thing is, when you talk about Win32 APIs, we've been adding them independent of any of these things. Developers have been asking us, they want to reuse code. So where we can add more Win32 to our universal platform, we've been adding those over the last 3 or 4 releases. We did .NET Standard, so we added a whole lot of .NET APIs as well. And really the goal is to make it easier. And the trade-off there, I'll just reiterate the trade-off because not everybody knows this. Adding every API adds a lot of code to the OS image and a lot of duplicate APIs. And so we've kind of tried to balance bringing everything in versus bringing in the right set that lets us make a good balance between good solid APIs, ones that are used by most, and not some of these esoteric APIs.
And so it really isn't a part of like these given features have driven the expanded APIs. As you mentioned, we're constantly looking at APIs that we should make durable, make that promise for developers about.
Right, for the universal platform.
For the universal platform.
There's also the desktop platform, which we also have some promises there, just not as well-defined set of APIs that we've done for, say, traditional Win32 applications.
Sure. So a couple more questions on multi-instance that we have. This is a good one. I think you touched on it a little bit, Andrew. Like in an app that has shared data that it's accessing, whether that's a text file or an XML file or even SQLite as that example, how should multiple instance developer work with apps using that type of model?
Well, as I say, you've really got two choices. You either partition the data, so you don't try and access one file or one database or one cache. You have 2 or 3 or 4, a per instance table in your database, or a per instance file, or a per instance cache. So that's one way, and that avoids any problems of multiple accesses to the same thing, is because you have different things, you have multiple instances of it. And that also might be a positive benefit anyway, because each instance, one of the reasons you've gone multi-instance is that each instance might actually have isolated data for that instance, and there's no reason to pollute some other instance's data with across instances. So it might actually be something you're doing anyway to partition your data. If that's not appropriate, or for some reason you can't do that, then you're back to synchronization primitives like mutexes. So you can use a named mutex. I've actually got an example here. I can probably show you this if I can find it. This one. So here I've got an app that's doing update files. It's just doing arbitrary reads and writes to, as you said, the current application data current. So this is package specific. So if multiple instances write to this at the same time, there's going to be a problem. But this update file method is wrapped by using a sync helper, and a sync helper is really just this custom class I've invented that's using a named mutex.
I see.
So the point is, you grab the mutex, you write to the file, you do whatever you're doing in there, you release the mutex. Each instance is doing this so that if multiple instances are running at the same time, they don't actually have concurrent instance, they have interleaved access to the data, so that none of them are blocked for very long, because each instance is grabbing it and releasing it very quickly, and so the next one comes along and grabs it and releases it. Whereas if I didn't have that, then the first one to grab it would basically be locking the file. The second one would probably crash, or it would at least get an exception if it's in a try-catch block, and it would be blocked for the duration then. So it's a standard mechanism that has been around for a long time. Just use a name mutex. Cross-process, invent your name, works wonders.
So so Carlo asked that question, so thanks, Carlo. And then that also, you reiterated again what Jerry's question is about application data. So any of the APIs that are package-specific, that doesn't change. So these kind of go hand in hand. When you're using package-specific APIs, you could have a situation where you're trying to write to something that's locked, and you need to guard against it, basically, and be smart about that. If you opt in, multi-instance is an opt-in, it's not a default, right? Yeah. And so if you opt into these capabilities,
And this example, if you look at it, I'm using my local data folder, effectively, which is going to be package specific, so it's accessible to all of the instances. But I'm just saying, well, I'm going to create this file. In every instance, I'm going to create the same file. Well, the other way, as I say, would be just don't do that. Don't create a file that's different for each instance. So each instance, you could put an ID on it and say, well, my file name is not myfile.txt, it's this instance id.txt or whatever. And then the problem goes away. So I've kind of deliberately said, well, I'm always going to write to this same file, which is why I'm having to put a mutex around it. But you have the other choice.
So you used to ask a question online as well. This is interesting. So in the app model, we've had the capability of communicating app to apps, right? We have different protocols we can create app to apps. Do we have similar capabilities now to create communication between instances of my same app?
To an extent, yes. So, that's a nice segue. Let me create another, which one am I using? Sorry, I've still got this running. Let me stop this. And actually, I should also call out, you will have noticed, this was app 2, the previous one that I ran. I had 4 instances running. When I stop debugging, all 4 of them are stopped. And reading between the lines, what's happening is that because they're in the same package, Visual Studio, the debug session is attaching to all of them, which is exactly what you want. If you're debugging a multi-instance app, you want all of the, the debug.write lines to go to the same debug session. When you've set breakpoints, whichever instance you hit the breakpoint in, you want it to hit the breakpoint. So that's what happens. So when you're debugging a multi-instance app, you're debugging multiple instances.
That's awesome.
But
and that process to the developer was seamless. Didn't have to do anything special. F5 was still the F5.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's right.
That's great.
So let me show you this other template that we've got. I said there were two multi-instance templates. The simple one that we just looked at, where you just add the manifest entry, and this one, which is slightly more complicated. So I'll create one of these. And
now, while that's being created, I saw that you're changing the minimum supported version. Is that because these are new capabilities? Do we have to make sure that we're targeting the target version and min version correctly then?
Yes, yes. The feature has actually been supported since build 17074, and the SDK that went with that, which was 17069, which came out about a month ago. So every build since then has the capability in there. The project templates we've only just published today.
Okay.
But so I'll show you the code for this, and then I'll show you an example that's a little more complicated. So there's a couple of things in here that are different. Remember let me show you the code. In the simple example, we had the namespace declarations because we had this supports multiple instances. So that's still the same. There's nothing different there. The manifest is the same. You still declare that this app supports multiple instances. But in addition to that, we've given you this extra file, this program.cs, and in there we've given you a main. So again, like the console app, we have main in here. Now, this is a C# UWP app. So it's not a console app. It's a regular windowed app, but it has its own main. And you may not be aware, but there's a comment in here which we put in the template deliberately just to make the point that if I go to the project settings and look under the build settings here, you'll see that there is this symbol defined in the build settings, disable XAML generated main, because what normally happens in a normal XAML app is that you don't have that symbol defined, and in which case you get a main defined for you as part of the build process that looks exactly like this.
In the app XAML class, in the app XAML file is where it ends.
One of the partial files of the app XAML class, yes. So you don't normally see this because it's not part of your source code, it's part of the build. So in your OBJ directory, there will be this file eventually when you build. And that's all it does, is it instantiates your app class object and it passes it to application start. So, but we suppressed that. We said don't generate the default main, instead use this main. And again, this main, because it's now exposed in your source code, you can do whatever you like in here. I'll show you an example of how this is used, but let me just call out a couple of things in the API. Firstly, there's this new type app instance, and I'm calling getActivatedEventArgs. I'll explain what these do in a minute, but just to call them out now. GetActivatedEventArgs, find or register, and redirect activation to. Now, let me show you an example that I've got already built. So this is the Banana app. The Banana app registers a file association. So if I double-click a Banana file, it runs the app and opens the file. And because it's multi-instanced, I can open multiple instances, each one with a different file. So I've got 3 instances here. And again, just for the purposes of demoing, I've numbered them 1, 2, and 3 because
in the upper corner there on the picture.
The app can keep track of how many instances it has. I've got Lorem Ipsum open, I've got Shakespeare open, and I've got Tennyson open. So let me just minimize these just to make a point. If I go back to Explorer and I say, okay, what if I try and open Shakespeare again? Well, what it does is it brings up instance number 2. Again, it doesn't create a 4th instance. So you can see from the taskbar, I've still only got 3 instances running. And what's happening here is that this is a more complex scenario where the app has said, firstly, I want to be multi-instance. So we said, fine, we'll multi-instance you. Every time there's any kind of activation of the app, whether it's a file activation or a protocol activation or a launch from a tile on start, we'll create a new instance. but we will also call into the app and say, hey, the user's tried to open this file. Is that okay? Do you want to go ahead with this or not? And it's up to the app what it wants to do. So in this case, the app is saying, well, no, you've already got it open in another instance, because I can see all my other instances, and I can see that one of them has already got this file open. So I'm saying, well, no, I don't support opening the same file in 2 instances, so I'm not going to allow you to do that. Instead, I'm going to redirect. So this is back to the APIs, this is get the activated event args, which tells you, is this a file activation, is this a protocol activation, and so on. You get more information from that. And then I'm going to see if there is an existing instance that already has that file open. It's probably better if I show you the code for the app itself rather than the template. Get activated event args. It's saying, is this a file activated event args? If so, pull out the first file and find or register the file name. And that it's kind of a strangely named function, but it's because it does 2 things. It either finds an instance, if there's already an instance that has already registered that file name, then it will find it and it will return that as the app instance. And if not, if there's no other instance that already has this file open, then it will register this instance instead. In which case, the instance coming back will be the current instance.
And how did you register that key initially? Is that just based on the activation protocol itself?
Yeah, so the key is just a string. So I'm saying, well, the string I'm going to use is the file name. And I got the file name from the file activated event args that came in. But it could be anything. I mean, it's entirely up to the app what that string is.
And just the scenario example we're using is a file-based launch.
Just happens to be.
It could be, again, it could be a console app that's using an arg that comes into it or something like that.
Could be it's whatever the activated event args are coming in. And you don't even have to base it on that. You could just invent some string with your own logic based on whatever, the time of day or, is it raining today? It's entirely up to the app what its logic is. It just needs to pass some string in there that it will understand, so that later on when it finds all the other instances, it knows what that string means. And it could be a complex string built up of multiple parameters, if you like, that it's then going to parse. It's entirely up to the app.
So John's asking, what if I want more than a string? Is it different properties or things? Is that possible? Can I do something like that?
That's a very good question. We actually thought about this when we were designing the API, because just like you, probably we thought, well, there could be multiple things I want to put in here, and I'd like a property bag with, so I can put name value pairs in there. The trade-off, and it was a hard decision. We went for simplicity first in this first release. The trade-off is that remember what's happening is that the app is being activated, the platform is calling into the app to say, what do you want to do? And the app is running some logic to figure out what it wants to do. Now, it's only got a certain amount of time to do that. It's just like any app start. If you don't start showing your window within a certain amount of time, we'll assume that you've hung and we'll terminate you. So the same applies here. If you don't figure out whether you want to redirect or continue this activation in quick enough, we're just going to terminate you. So if you start doing complex operations on heavily nested data structures, it's just going to take too long. So we said, okay, you can simulate a structured data item by having a complex string, which, as I say, you can parse with whatever parameters. You can think of it as a URL with parameters in there. So you can put your name value pairs in there. Right. That's not to say that we wouldn't add property bag support later if it turns out that that's something that is critical to people. We could do.
So I think it's just understanding, our developer base, and if people have feedback and certain things, and that's good for us to hear, right? So I see a question, I think we already answered it, from Jerry, talking about multi-instance. Is there a way to catch some activate instead of launch? And I think that's what we just talked about, was basically that is the redirection path, right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
pattern, right?
Yes, and you could, this example, as I say, is just saying, well, I'm only interested in files, and my whole purpose is to make sure that I don't open the same file in multiple instances. But it could be anything. You could do whatever you like with the incoming args from whatever type of activation it was, and use whatever logic you like based on that. And you could say, well, I'll have one instance that's doing all my toast notification activations, and I'll have a different instance that's doing my protocol activation, and another instance that's doing my normal tile tap activation, if you want. I don't know that would make sense, but you could. And the point is, it's up to the app to decide its own logic.
That's great. So I want to make sure, we said we want to talk about 3 things. I want to move on to that third thing because that sounded exciting to me too.
Exciting.
I think it's something that developers have wanted a long time for UWP. Better file system access.
Yep.
Right? So Tell us
Yeah.
what's coming.
Basically, right now developers, when you have file system access, you can't get access to the whole file system. We restrict that because in many cases it's just not needed in the application and is a risk for the system. But as we've listened to our developers, there are definitely a class of applications that want to be able to look across a broader part of the file system. So we're introducing 2 new concepts to allow that to happen. Both of them are under a capability, so that you have to ask for the capability, and we just want to make sure that, we always talk about like, oh, does that mean you're going to be able to check out my app and make sure my app, does exactly what I say it does? No, we want to make sure that if you need a certain capability, your app uses it and uses it properly. And if you don't need it, why did you ask for it? And so it's kind of just making sure that an app only gets what an app needs.
Right.
And so we do some checking to make sure what our capabilities are. And some of these capabilities are pretty powerful capabilities. And so we've just made sure that while we give it in a responsible way to developers, and they use it in the most appropriate way.
So now, did you just give me the capability to write to C:temp?
Yes.
I'll have to go through
Maybe.
all the
Right.
different capability.
It depends. So, yeah, I've got a couple of examples here. Let me see if I can find them. I've got them open in. So the first one is, so as Kevin says, there's 2 different ways based on 2 different things that you put in your manifest. This is the first one, where what I've put in my manifest is an app execution alias. This is the same thing that's used for console apps. It's the same thing that's used for command activation of a windowed app. Basically, you specify an alias. So this one has specified this, the app is called Command Line File Browser, and so it's chosen the alias CLFB. And I'll just run that. I'm going to run that from start, my CLFB. When I run it from start, you'll see that what it's doing is it's picking up, it's doing a file browse from the point at which it was executed. So
Which would be the package location.
Right.
Is that right?
Right. But if I do it from command prompt, so let's get rid of that, CLFB, then it's running it and it's giving it access from wherever I happen to be in the file system. So now it's giving me access to temp. So up until now, remember the only way you can really give the user access to the file system is you would pop a file picker dialog, and the user could then navigate through the file system and they would pick a file or they'd pick a folder. And that's the user giving your app permission to that file or folder. So this is kind of similar in the sense that, if I change directory, let's go to some other directory and run it from there. And wherever the user has gone to in the file system, in the command prompt, they're saying, well, implicitly I'm giving permission. I've chosen to run this app from a command line, firstly, and I've also chosen where exactly in the file system I'm going to run it from. So that's implicitly giving permission to the app for all of the files in the file system from that point downwards.
Now, I know that you already had this app deployed, and one of the things that similar to our other models where you had the file dialog and things like that, is there a consent step here that
Not for this one, no. This is the as we went through some very extensive security reviews on this and privacy reviews on this, and we decided that this is very similar to the user navigating the file system in a file picker, where they're explicitly giving you permission based on the files that they choose there. This is the same because they've had to have gone to a command prompt first. They've had to have navigated to a particular place in the file system, and they've had to have chosen to run your app from that point. So that's implicit permission. And obviously that should be made clear in the app that that's what it's doing. But also, don't forget, they get permission to the file system that the user has, whatever permissions the user has. And the user doesn't necessarily have permission to everything anyway. So down in here somewhere, there may well be some system files that the user can't touch anyway, can't even see potentially. So the app would be in the same boat. It can only see what the user can see.
I see. So what about the ones where the user intent wasn't made, right? I just have a normal app and it's silently writing files. But I want it to write to, a different document storage,
Right.
C:, bar, whatever.
Okay. Well, so that's the second mechanism. So the other mechanism we have is, I've got an example here. This one requires a restricted capability. We've called it broad file system access. You have to declare that in the manifest. And as Kevin said, that means that there will be some additional scrutiny to make sure that you really have that you do need this and you're not just declaring it just for the sake of it, and you have a good reason for doing it. But I can run that from anywhere, and again, this will get files from wherever I choose. So in here I could say, well, okay, suppose I want to get files from temp. Does that work? Yes, it just gets me the files from temp. Well, suppose I want to get files from the root. Does that work? Yes, it does. So this gives you access to everything in the file system. It's not just from some point downwards, it's everywhere. But for this, there is a capability. I've already run this multiple times on this device, but otherwise it would have come up with a prompt the very first time.
A consent dialog.
A consent dialog saying, you sure you want to do this?
And so similar to other consent properties we have in the APIs, that is also something you should guard against, right? So your code, before you actually execute what you think is going to be, make sure that that consent was given.
Yeah.
Right. Because maybe they didn't give consent.
Maybe they didn't give it, yeah.
And you don't want your app just crashing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it could change dynamically, because remember, with all of these privacy settings, there is a setting in the settings app where they can turn it on and off. So they may have said yes now, and then later on they changed their minds, went into settings and turned it off again. So just because you got it the first time doesn't mean to say you're always going to get it.
Right.
So you have to be resilient, as you said.
So I'm an enterprise developer. I have a line of business application. Maybe I'm the manager of this application. I deploy it to 80,000 people on the desktop. I really don't want my users to be saying no to that consent dialog. So, and I have control of my app. Is there a better way for me to give global consent?
Yeah, you can, because like many settings, you can apply group policy to this. So you can say at an enterprise level that this is always enabled or is always disabled, and the users then can't change it. And it doesn't matter what the app does. The app can keep asking if it wants to, but that's just going to annoy people. But once it's been told, and it will be told that this has been denied, either it's been denied by the user or it's been denied by system policy. So it knows, if it's been denied by system policy, I'm probably not going to ask again because I'm not going to get it.
Right. So a flexible model, depending if I'm Tim Hewer developer versus super big corp developer, I can implement the policies in a different way and let my user choose consent or actually do it by policy.
If you're in a department that does some sort of deployment or checks the system or some diagnostics or something like that, you can go deploy those applications to the people that make sense, and only those applications will have broad file system access, and other ones will not. Even if the user tries to consent, you can move, say in my enterprise, only these applications have it. So it kind of gives the best of flexibility where end users can choose it on end user machines, and in a corporate environment, the IT manager can choose it, or leave it up to the individuals to choose.
Right. This is awesome. So these kind of three features we kind of walk through, are they all available in the latest Insider Flight and SDKs?
Yes, yes, they're all there. As I say, the templates for Visual Studio are coming a bit late. We've published the templates today for console apps and multi-instance apps. You don't need any templates for the file system access. It's just extra declarations.
Just a manifest. Yeah. That's awesome. So if people want to play around with it, now's the time to go get it. Give us feedback. Yeah, that's right. We want to make sure that we understand the right scenarios and things like that. So
give it. I mean, we really want people to use it. Try to use it in a real world environment. Tell us where potentially there's some rough edges, and that we can continue to look at it. Won't be much changes now for this iteration of it, but we definitely want to go take it early feedback for our next release as well.
That's great. So should we take some questions?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right, let's take some more questions. So Manfred online had a good question about the app execution alias. Are the app aliases global? Over time, lots of apps. Is it first in, first out? If I register foo and somebody else register foo, where normally the path is a differentiator. How does the app alias work in these scenarios?
It is first in, first out. So let me just go to settings and show you that under apps, one thing that we added for this release is an extra page for managing app execution aliases. So in there, you can see, let's see, for example, I've got two, I don't know if you can see this, but I've got two apps that both want the same alias. This one is registered foo, and this one down here is registered foo. And this is exactly your point, is that over time, inevitably, particularly because these are short aliases, people are going to have name clashes. So what happens is the first one that gets installed gets to win, but the user can always change their mind. So they can say, well, actually, I want this one to to have its alias, in which case the one down here is automatically turned off.
I see. Okay.
So you can only have one at a time for a given alias, obviously. But you can choose which one it is, or in fact, the user can just turn them both off if they want to. If they, for some reason, they say, well, I don't want to accidentally type in foo, they could turn them all off.
Is the app execution alias something that you can register as a part of your app name registration or anything like that, or is this purely like a manifest?
No, it's looser than that because we don't want to control the aliases that people pick.
Right.
It's just right now the only mitigation, as I say, is you choose one. If there were 100 different apps that wanted foo, you'd have to pick one.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, later on maybe it would make sense to add some more disambiguation to that, but right now that's the behavior.
Okay. So Nirmal has a question about file system access in console apps through the UWP APIs. I think there's no different there, right? I mean,
No.
it is
Right.
a UWP, so whether it's a console app, full app,
Works the
multi-instance app, it's
Yep.
still, as long as you have that policy, the consent, or your group policy, like it would still work the same there,
Yep.
right? That's great.
right.
Tusef asks us, can I access all video and audio files of the user and also use them later for playlists without a future access list limitation?
Yes, if you've got broad file system access, then you have access to everything that the user has access to with the same permissions. So what you do with that information is up to you. But as I say, we're going to be a little more careful about granting permission for this if you're not doing something that's going to be of benefit to the user, because there is a privacy issue here. If we just give all apps automatic permission to everything, then there is definitely an information disclosure issue. So we won't do that. So you have to kind of convince us when you submit the app that you're doing something that's going to be useful to the user and not detrimental.
And useful to the app too, right? As you said, you're kind of protecting the developer too, right? Yeah.
Right. The goal is, do you need it or not? So it wasn't like, one of the things you'll see over time is your app should really only get the capabilities that it needs. Giving it more tends just to mean accidental, erase things by accident, like modify things you weren't supposed to modify. Just like we've protected system files, we want to protect most of the files on the system except where it makes sense. And here, if it makes sense, we'll give the app permission. But if they were an app talking to a service and never wrote anything to the file system but asked for broad file system access, we'd probably go back saying you probably want to not ask for that.
Right.
You didn't really use it. And if you're not using it for some purpose, you're just a risk. Imagine you run ads. You can get risk that we don't protect the user, protect the developer.
Yep, I think it makes sense. Tomash asks, what happens if, I think we kind of just covered this, but I'll ask a question. What happens if somebody picks an existing alias, ipconfig or dir or ping or something for their command line app, Alex?
Well, they could.
Maybe these are a little bit more special because these are system kind of apps already.
The app execution alias is basically added to the end of the path. So it's likely that ipconfig or dir certainly would be before in precedence. It would be before the end of the path. So there shouldn't be a clash there. But it's always possible. In which case the user has the mitigation of turning it off in settings.
Okay. Nirmal asked this question, and I noticed it too. I was going to ask this. In the manifest in the app execution alias, you had app1.exe and clfb.exe, but when you were actually in the console, you weren't forced to type exe. Can it be .app or .foo or anything like that, or does it have to be match the entry point?
The alias that you declare in the manifest must have .exe on the end, but you don't have to supply .exe when you use it in the command line.
I see. Eustace, can a UWP app also access files on the USB stick, external drive, or network shares?
Basically, anywhere that the user has access to. So if, as an ordinary user, they could access this, then the app can access this, provided you've given them the broad file system access. So yes.
As long as the capability is there,
Yes.
anywhere where that particular user's permissions allow,
Yep.
then allow. They're not sidestepping any of that.
Yep.
That's good. Manfred, is there a mechanism for more complex communication between instances of the same app, or will that go through some sort of REST, name pipe, IP communication? So I think we touched on this a little bit earlier.
Yeah, so right now, the API that we've provided is specifically geared towards the redirection scenario. But as part of that, remember, you get to register some arbitrary string that's app-defined. And you can use the API to discover other instances of your own app and you will get back that string as part of that discovery so that you can see what other instances are doing or what they've registered themselves for. But that's about the extent of it right now, because going forward, you could imagine that if you wanted additional communication, cross instances, you would probably want to do that with in-proc app services, which in this current release we don't support. But that's something that's on the list to try and add later on if we can, if there's enough demand for that sort of thing.
Right. So Jerry asked, I think we already answered this, but we'll ask again. Is there a way to catch I see the difference here. Is there a way to catch a toast or a push notification and do the activate of basically the redirection instead of a launch? So that redirection for multi-instances, is that accessible in any activation path, whether that was a toast notification or?
Yes, because if you remember back to the code, the code that you put in to decide your redirection is in main, and main happens before anything else. This is one of the reasons we give you a main, is because that's the first thing in your app that's going to be called. It's long before on launched or on activated or on file activated or any of those overrides. So it's way before any of that. So very early on, right at the beginning of main, you can get the activated event arc. So you can figure out what kind of activation this is and then perform whatever your logic is. And then when you do a redirect, we just hook into the normal activation path. So if you say, I've decided I don't want to continue this new activation, I want to redirect to some other instance, then that other instance will get a call into its on activated or its on file activated or whatever the override it has for the different types of activation. And then it's as normal, because it will get the original arguments coming in that were passed to the second instance and then now being passed back to the first instance.
Got it. So Nirmal asks, this is a good one. Can PWA and web apps be multi-instance as well?
They can be multi-instanced. They can't use redirection right now. So redirection is not available for web apps, but normal multi-instancing is, and that works.
Is redirection something that's going to come, or is that going to be based on feedback?
Based on feedback,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's two different ways to do that. I mean, a PWA is a pretty simplified wrapper that we do, and we try to make it simple because it works in a standard way with the way the industry has accepted kind of how PWAs operate. But if you're building a web app, you're just really building a native app that hosts the web control, the web view. And in that world, you really get the same main. It really is just a native app with a web control inside of it. So if you are building an app that is completely a web application, you can just do the same thing. Take the template, put a web view inside of it, and you're done.
That's where make sure you disable that, either use the template or make sure you add that pre-compile symbol to generate your own main, basically, and do some of those things. Yeah.
Even exactly the same templates. They don't have to be XAML-based. They can be web-based as well.
Right.
Lots of apps mixed together.
Right.
So.
Martin asks, is drag and drop supported by broader file access? This solves, I'm going to read this URL completely. No, I'm just kidding. So is drag and drop supported by broader file access?
Is drag and drop supported? I don't know that we actually tested that. I would say yes, it should be. I'd have to go back and test it to make sure.
I think this is actually specifically with a read-only attribute. Removing the read-only attribute. So maybe something we need to
follow up on that.
Yeah, good question, Martin. He has the URL specifically on our user voice site, so he's already given us feedback. We'll follow up. So one last question here, getting back to the console apps, and John's asked, what if my console app needs access to Win32 APIs? Is that possible? I think we kind of addressed it a little bit, but let you guys wrap up.
All the Win32 APIs or any of the APIs in UWP are available, right? Except maybe creating some UI, because you're really not in UI at that point. But all the other APIs are fully available. Not every Win32 API is available to UWP applications, but a very broad set. And if you do find gaps, I always tell developers, if you find gaps where you do need an API, let us know. We are adding new APIs all the time, and we can add more in.
That's great. This is a really good preview. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today and showing us multi-instance, UWP console apps, broader file system access, just 3 of the things that are coming in the next release, and all available now for everyone to try out in the insider flights and get the build, get the SDK, go get the Visual Studio templates from the marketplace, and give us feedback.
Yep.
And be sure to join us on March 7th. For Windows Developer Days, where we'll talk about these things, I'm sure, a little bit deeper dive.
And a whole lot more.
And a whole lot more. So appreciate you again for the time.
It's great.
And thank you everybody online for watching, and really like doing these community stand-ups. So we'll keep doing them and give you guys the opportunity to engage with Kevin and the different people that work on the developer platform for Windows. So thank you guys for joining us, and thank everybody at home for watching, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.